Good morning. Isn't it exciting to be back to where it all began? As James introduced us, we're going to go back in time. We're going to go back also to discuss the history of micromobility a little bit. It's only been a couple of years, but it's time to set forth the 10 commandments of micromobility, the foundation that we built everything on, the theory of micromobility, the axioms, the basic truths. To kick off, nobody invented micromobility. It's not an invention. There was no eureka moment. There was no R&D budget. There was no moonshot. Micromobility is the confluence of thousands of ideas and the work of thousands of people. And we built on the shoulders of giants. We coalesced and we combined their efforts to make this idea happen. And just as a simple example of that, if you think about the lithium-ion battery, that enables this technology. It also enabled previous technologies. It was invented in the 1990s, if you want to talk about inventions. It was put initially to market in camcorders, and much later in automobiles. And only now, when the costs have come down, as you see here, and the density has gone up, as you see here, it has become economical to introduce them in tiny vehicles. And this is what we call an enabler. And there are many fundamental enablers that enabled micromobility. Lithium-ion batteries, brushless motors, GPS, the smartphone, and of course the cellular network that allows the communications to happen. As a result, in the 20-year period, when some of the early micromobility vehicles existed, like the Segway, the costs have come down by 15 times, making it possible to use this technology to mobilize millions of people. In fact, hundreds of millions of people. In fact, we are going to reach billions of people with this technology. So that's number one. It's not an invention, and nobody invented it. Point number two, short trips are bigger than long trips. By this I mean they're more important. And you've seen this in our introduction video. It is the distribution of trips in the United States. Yes, the land that loves the automobile, the land that 2% of which is covered with roads, and in which there are tens of millions of parking spaces, actually probably hundreds of millions. And yet, as you can see, this shows that most trips are short. Let me simplify that graph a little bit. Let me bin things, put them in bins of 0 to 5 instead of 0 to 1, and 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on. And what you can see immediately is that the 0 to 5 bin has half the trips. And then the 5 and onward, therefore, has to be the other half. But of the 5 and onward, half again are in the second bin. So already we have this distribution of ever-decreasing probability of long trips, and then we put everything above 25 in one bin. As you can see, that's quite a bit less than 10% of all trips. Now that's not all driven miles, but it's trips. It's instances of a journey. But that reminded me of something. And think about the phone in your pocket. And I know you have one. And it's a smartphone. And you pick it up either 58 times a day on average, or unlocking, in the case of the iPhone, 80 times a day. And did you know that you touch that phone 1,000 times a day? And did you know that there's 1 billion iPhone users and probably 4 billion smartphone users? So that means you touch, or we touch, devices like these 4 trillion times a day. That's a lot of utilization, and that we should learn from. And actually, what happened to this industry, which is only, as of now, about 13 years old, we can look at the same distribution of usage. In this case, measuring the duration of our usage. How many minutes of use is a smartphone used? And look what you see. In fact, 70% is 0 to 2, 15% 2 to 4, and so on. So every 2 minutes is a bin. Similar distribution. In fact, let's put them together. The utilization of smartphones and of automobiles in the United States follow a similar pattern in that the shorter and the smaller is the most probable. And that means, if you think about it, that these trillions and trillions of uses every day, which didn't exist more than 15 years ago, are a new market that nobody asked for. And so think about the automobile trips and how many new trips can be made that are even shorter that we don't make today. Because computation before 2007 meant a keyboard and probably a mouse. And automobility today is what transportation is thought of. Compete against non-consumption. Big trips are not as important as small trips. Next, number 3, the car is a bundle. Someone wise once said that there's only 2 ways to make money in technology: bundling and unbundling. Well, guess what? The car is a bundle, and if you unbundle it, you make money. Lots of money. And how is it so? If you go back to our distribution graph, in reality, you can substitute the short trips with small vehicles, and you can substitute the long trips with bigger vehicles that are shared, like airplanes, which we already do, and many more train opportunities that exist and will emerge. But these have been around for a while. What we're seeing is the empowerment of vehicles that solve the short trip distance, which is, again, where all the value is. And this process of taking that optionality that's now in the car and distributing amongst all these alternatives is where the opportunity lies. And I will point out that it's much more likely you're going to see iteration in the top of this stack than you will in the bottom. Because how long does it take for a new airplane to get designed, put into use, and eventually taken out of use? You measure things down here in the decades. In the middle, you measure them in years, and in the top, we measure things in months. Again, the smaller it gets, the bigger it gets. And by this I mean volumes. Let's look at the computer industry again. In this case, even before the smartphone. Here in the first wave, which let me point out what the details here represent. This is starting in 1975 and goes to 2011. A short history of personal computing, if you will. And here in the beginning, we see platforms, most of which don't exist anymore. Things like Commodore, Atari, and Apple II. Even Next is here, the TRS-80 that I used in high school, right over there. But out of that innovation, if you will, out of that let a thousand flowers bloom, we ended up with the PC, which is the blue line, continuing its growth throughout the 1990s, and the Macintosh, which survived, but was orders of magnitude less successful and less popular. But then something magical happened in around 2000, which is people starting putting computers in their pockets. First as PDAs and then as phones. And that led to yet another explosion of new ideas and new operating systems and new platforms. And we ended up with this period. Again, this is 10 years ago, the end of this graph. And already we see here the Android and the iPhone are up there reaching towards the PC numbers. But I played a trick on you with this data. This is a log graph. That's 1,000, 10,000, and up to 1,000,000, or this is 1 billion, actually. 1,000,000, I should have said. Here is the data shown in a linear graph. And all of that churn, all of that activity in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s is invisible now. It did happen, but the numbers were too small to show up on this graph. And instead, what you see here is just how big Android and iPhone became. But remember, they're part of a team. All the mobile guys got together and started to invent the future. And as a result, if you were to put all mobile together, it blew the PC away. And today, although we still have the PC, and we're still using them, these slides are up here because of a PC. Day to day, trillions of times a day, actually, we use these small devices as our primary computation. And so let's put this together. Fruit flies and elephants, I call it. This is my projection, or our projection, of the micromobility market in 2035. So the micromobility is this yellow line, and then there's the electric automobility, which is everyone's favorite sort of future transportation mode, which is this white, or not ours, everyone else's. But anyway, this white area, which is the future of electric cars in terms of units sold. And our expectation is that we're going to be outselling 2 to 1. And we are outselling much more than that today, if you see the numbers in 2020 and 21. But again, I overlaid the story of computation on the same graph. And the similarity is striking. How the small grew faster than the big, and how the small eventually overwhelmed the big. And we ended up with a future of not just microcomputing, but mobile computing, which is what we have in our pockets. Number 5, you can't get there from here. Now this is more of a, let's say, I'm most passionate about this subject because it's something that I've spent the last year thinking about, which is how do we solve the climate crisis with micromobility? And here's the dilemma. There are currently 1.1 billion cars in use. You can approximate that that's 1.1 billion drivers out there driving. And this is where they are. As a map, you see the individual numbers here in terms of, let's say, 57 million in Japan. Let's see, about 30 million in France, about 11 million in Australia, and so on. But actually, this is 2005. If we move forward to the present, 2020, things have gone up. So let me go back and forth, as you can see sort of the way these bubbles pop. And what do you notice immediately, right? There's China. China went from 20 million cars to 208 million cars. And that's just in 15 years. And so the population of vehicles in the world, this is the bottom area graph here, has doubled. And this is the future. This is extrapolating based on the adoption curves in all the other countries in the world. And by the way, even the richest countries and the most saturated ones are seeing their numbers go up. There are more cars than ever in all of our cities, in all of our communities. And this is the dilemma. If you even try to convert these to electric, the emissions in greenhouse gases is still going to rise. The transportation sector, in particular the personal transportation sector, is going to completely fail to lower its emissions. In fact, it's going to probably increase by 60%, an intolerable situation, and probably an illegal one, because laws are being drafted to make these being cars impossible. And so what do we substitute them with? We can do twice with half in micromobility. Twice the number of drivers or consumers using vehicles with half of the emissions that we would get if we were using electric cars even. And the point of it is that we can't get there using the roadmap of automobility. And this is going to permeate and diffuse as a thought over the next few years. And it'll become clearer and clearer that automobility is not going to save us from climate crisis. Electric automobility is not going to save us. Next point, next commandment. Don't dig where there is no treasure. And what do I mean by this? Basically, all infrastructure is a sunk cost. I'm going to say this again. All infrastructure is a sunk cost. That means that everything we've built that we're afraid to tear down because it costs so much is a wrong way to make a decision. You have to ask, what is going to replace it? Is it better? And should we do that? And in which case, who cares how much it costs? All the arguments that we have as to why we shouldn't change our infrastructure is because it costs so much money. And that is a fallacy. Take, for example, these two pieces of land. One covered by the city of Siena, the center of Siena in Italy, population 30,000. The other, an interchange in Houston, Texas, population 0. They're the same area on a map. Now, the citizens of Houston could choose to say, we want to live like the Italians. But they say no, because that costs so much money, we need to keep it. And by the way, let's just build more of it, because that's what we're used to. This is a fallacy. We've completely destroyed and demolished infrastructures in the past. Our railroads, before them, the canal systems. Why do we think that this has to be forever? It doesn't. It just, the light has to come on. That it can be, it's much better to demolish. The next point. What about expectations? They promised us flying taxis. Not too long ago, actually. 4 years ago. We got bike lanes. Now, this might be seen as a sort of a joke, but this is where the money's going. If you look at these headlines, this is from 2016, 2017, and 2019. Everything about self-driving, flying, Hyperloop, and rocketry as a solution, as an imminent solution to our transportation problems, calling these things transportation revolutions. How many hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent on these? This is only four years ago, or 5 years at the latest. We are not going to get there through these types of moonshots. We're not going to get there through hyperbole. We're going to get there through humility. And micromobility is humility, the queen of virtues. And I'll tell you something, bike lanes are a hell of a lot better than any of this crap. And now about managing the customer expectation. You sell miles, but customers buy smiles. The greatest companies in the world know that they sell experiences. And this has happened, even if you dream of it, even though you know it's going to be there, in the meantime, you sort of had to muddle through to some other business model, to some other sale that you have to make. But be very aware that at the end of the day, adoption is going to happen because of satisfaction, because of pleasure, joy, and the sheer unbridled optimism of the user. If you go back even, I talk about the phone and computer a lot, but think about the history of mobile phones before even the smartphone. In the beginning, it was about selling minutes. The whole business model was about average revenue per user, and then we ended up with selling messages, which are a data service. And that was with the Nokia phones in roughly the late 90s, early 2000s. And then it became a media business and then an experiences business with the iPhone. But this is happening again with transportation. We go from machine business models to miles business models to eventually smiles business models. And keep that goal in mind. Your satisfaction of the customer, the experiences you're going to create for them are going to eventually be the real lifeblood of this business. So micromobility, unlike automobility, which is having difficulty in transitioning, is going to make it much easier. Number 9, micromobility is a mind for the bicycle. Now again, this is something of an emotional topic for me because it was actually, this phrase I used came from, of course, Steve Jobs using a version of this called that the computer was a bicycle for the mind. And the bicycle for the mind idea came from an article written in 1973. He said this phrase in 1981, and he said that the computer was something that humans invented in order to make ourselves superhumans. And it was a tool not for the body, but for the mind. And it was a tool that amplified our reach, our power. And that has been my life. Since 1981, that's all I did, is follow in his footsteps. And now it's time for us to bring the mind, the computer, to the machine that moves us. And no machine absorbs that mind better than the bicycle or the scooter or all of the machines you see here today. Unlike automobility, micromobility absorbs software. It absorbs intelligence. It absorbs sensing. It absorbs data. Why? Again, because it moves like a fruit fly, not an elephant. Why? Because it's cheaper, because it's building on the shoulders of giants. And it's faster, and it's increasingly the smartest machine on the road. Just again to repeat what Steve's thinking was in 1981, the power of human minds allows us to invent solutions to overcome most of our physical and intellectual shortcomings. And now, I say, the power of software allows us to invent solutions to overcome most of our machines' shortcomings. The machines that have come to be our masters, if you will. Finally, the last commandment, cities always win. In the last event in Berlin, I said, micromobility is urban mobility. In fact, it's urban freedom because it gives you the sense of being able to do what you couldn't do before. But the key word is also urban. And we've gone through very trying times lately, where a lot of people wrote off the city. Since that event and now, there were a lot of people saying that cities are empty, people will flee, it's over. But you know, cities have gone through much worse. Cities were the home of plagues, fires, natural disasters, bombings, absolutely horrendous, carpet bombings, firestorms. And they were all rebuilt, and they all came back stronger than ever. The reason is that cities are anti-fragile. The more you stress them, the stronger they become, like a muscle. You work out, you get stronger. So this whole crisis has made us stronger, we believe. And it's not a story of only a few years. This story of urbanization, in this graph, this is the story of urbanization in terms of the entire population of the world, by the way. So back in 1900, we were somewhere around 1.7 billion people on the planet. By 2050, we're going to be near 9 billion people on the planet. But the split between rural and urban is overwhelmingly urban. We are an urban species. We are going to be 75% urban citizens. But this is a 5,000-year-old story. It's not just this is only 150 years here. It's 5,000 years that we've been living in cities. It was the way civilization exists. It's why commerce exists. It's why agriculture has able to actually feed us all, is because merchants could take the food to others. Cities are so important. They're our greatest invention. And we are the ones who are going to find a way to mobilize those people that are going to join the city of the future. Mega cities, 10 million or more people in them. There are going to be dozens and dozens of mega cities, most of them names you've never heard of. It's imperative that we serve them as much as we serve those of us in wealthy countries. And so, 10 commandments. What is micromobility then at the end of the day? Well, it's many things. It's an innovation, not an invention. It's small trips, the most common trips, the most popular trips, the most valuable trips. It's small vehicles that iterate quickly, that evolve rapidly, that as a result are extremely popular and get all the utilization. Its scale, its ability to grow rapidly, because that's the beauty of iteration. You're able to experiment constantly. I don't know who the winner is going to be among you, who's going to dominate the world, the next iPhone of mobility. But I think it's in this room today. And as I mentioned about getting there from here, micromobility is and will increasingly be seen as climate action. We're not going to be sitting back and waiting. We're going to take this opportunity to change the world for the better, especially for our children. And micromobility is a parallel value network. We're going to establish a new infrastructures that are side by side with the old, but it will eventually cause the old to go into disrepair, and it will cause the old to be demolished, and it will cause the old to be reinvented. It's happened before, 5 times in the history of humanity. Do not be afraid of erasing a lot of what we built. And it's a new market. It's an opportunity to reach out to people who do not consume, to people who do not take rides. And even though, as I said, we're going to do twice with half, we will see more people going more places. Just like with phones, we ended up doing much more with them than we did with just computers. More entertainment, more joy, more communication. And yes, more productivity and getting more work done. Absolutely. It was these phones that got us through this pandemic, and it became the way, our tether to humanity and civilization. And new businesses, new opportunities, new chance for you to find your fortune. Certainly, I think micromobility is going to happen. And it's software. Remember, platforms. Software is the thing that actually is the most common thing about this technology, is that it's enabled by it. And whether it's communication software or it's a motor controller, but it's really the intelligence that's going to make this product a superpower for the user. And finally, micromobility is urban mobility and urban freedom. And don't you ever give up hope on that. The future is super bright. Thank you very much.